Welcome to this deep dive into one of the darkest and most unsettling tales in American history. Well, here it is. The morning of October 15th, 2023, arrived in Harlan County, Kentucky, with the kind of cold that settles deep into the bones of Appalachian mountain towns. A thick fog rolled down from the Cumberland Mountains, wrapping itself around the valleys and hollows like a shroud, reducing visibility to barely 10 feet on the winding back roads that connected the scattered communities of this forgotten corner of America. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees overnight, unusual even for mid-autumn in this region, and the dampness in the air made everything feel colder than the thermometer suggested. Sheriff Michael Brennan had been on the force for 23 years, serving the people of Harlan County through economic collapse, the opioid epidemic, and the slow death of the coal mining industry that had once been the lifeblood of these mountains. At 51 years old, his face carried the weathered lines of a man who had seen too much suffering, too many families torn apart by poverty, addiction, and despair. But nothing in his 2 decades of law enforcement had prepared him for the call that came through the dispatch radio at 6:47 that morning. The voice of Deputy Sarah Matthews crackled through the static, strained and shaking in a way that immediately sent alarm through Brennan's chest. She had found something at the old Garrett property, 7 miles outside the town of Lynch, along a forgotten access road that led to an abandoned coal tipple. Her words were fragmented, struggling to maintain professional composure, but the message was clear enough. There was a body, a young woman, and the circumstances were unlike anything the department had encountered before. Brennan grabbed his heavy canvas jacket and headed out into the cold morning, his patrol vehicle cutting through the fog as he made his way up Route 160, past the shuttered storefronts of what had once been thriving mining communities. The towns along this stretch had been slowly dying for 40 years, ever since the coal companies started closing operations and moving their investments elsewhere. Boarded-up houses lined the roads, their porches sagging under the weight of neglect, yards overgrown with weeds and littered with rusted equipment. The few people still living here clung to the land their families had worked for generations, too poor to leave, too proud to abandon the mountains that had shaped their identity. The Garrett property sat at the end of a rutted dirt road that climbed steeply up the mountainside, winding through dense stands of oak and hickory trees that were just beginning to turn their autumn colors. The old house had been abandoned for 15 years, ever since Thomas and Eleanor Garrett had died within 6 months of each other, leaving no heirs willing to take on the burden of maintaining a property so remote and inaccessible. The house itself was a 2-story wooden structure built in the 1920s, its white paint long since peeled away to reveal weathered gray boards beneath. The front porch had partially collapsed, and several windows were broken, their glass scattered on the ground below. Deputy Matthews stood at the edge of the property, near an old oak tree that towered over the house, its massive branches spreading like arthritic fingers against the gray sky. She was 28 years old, relatively new to the department, having joined 3 years earlier after completing her criminal justice degree at Eastern Kentucky University. Her face had gone pale, and she held one hand pressed against her stomach as if fighting nausea. When Brennan approached, she simply pointed toward the tree without speaking. Hanging from one of the lower branches, suspended by a length of thick rope, was the body of a young woman dressed in a wedding gown. The white fabric of the dress stood out starkly against the dark bark of the tree and the muted colors of the autumn landscape. The rope had been tied around one of the thicker branches, about 12 feet off the ground, and the woman's body hung motionless, her feet dangling approximately 3 feet above the leaf-covered earth below. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, obscured by a cascade of dark hair that fell across her face. The wedding dress was elaborate, with intricate lace detailing on the bodice and a full skirt that hung limply in the still morning air. Brennan felt his stomach clench as he took in the scene. In all his years of law enforcement, he had responded to countless calls involving death, from overdoses to domestic violence to industrial accidents in the mines. But there was something profoundly disturbing about the image before him, the juxtaposition of the beautiful white wedding dress against the violence of the hanging, the careful staging of the scene in this remote, abandoned location. This was not a simple suicide. Someone had gone to great lengths to create this tableau, and the implications sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. He approached the tree carefully, his boots crunching on fallen leaves, his eyes scanning the ground for any evidence that might have been left behind. The area around the tree had been disturbed, the leaves scuffed and displaced, suggesting recent activity. There were tire tracks in the soft earth near the road, partially obscured by the morning dew but still visible enough to potentially yield useful information. He pulled out his phone and began documenting the scene, taking photographs from multiple angles before calling for additional support from the state police and the county medical examiner. As he waited for backup to arrive, Brennan studied the victim more closely, though he was careful not to disturb the body before the forensic team could process the scene. The woman appeared to be in her mid-20s, with delicate features and long dark hair that reached past her shoulders. Her hands hung at her sides, and he could see that her fingernails were painted a soft pink color, freshly manicured. She wore no shoes, and her bare feet showed no signs of dirt or abrasions that might indicate she had walked to this location. The wedding dress itself was clearly expensive, professionally tailored, with hundreds of tiny pearl beads sewn into the lace overlay. The most disturbing detail was the rope itself. It was not the rough hemp or nylon cord typically associated with suicides, but rather a thick braided rope that looked almost decorative, the kind that might be used for nautical purposes or theatrical productions. It had been tied with a complex knot that suggested knowledge and deliberation, not the desperate improvisation of someone in the throes of suicidal desperation. Everything about the scene suggested careful planning and staging, as if someone had wanted to create a specific image, a particular statement. Deputy Matthews finally spoke, her voice still shaky but regaining some of its professional steadiness. She had conducted a preliminary search of the immediate area and found no identification, no purse, no personal belongings that might help identify the victim. The only other item of note was a small bouquet of white roses lying on the ground beneath the body, arranged carefully as if placed there intentionally. The flowers were fresh, their petals still intact, with no signs of wilting despite the cold temperature. By 8:30, the scene had been secured and a full forensic team from the Kentucky State Police had arrived to begin processing the evidence. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Holland, made the difficult climb up to the Garrett property, her equipment cases heavy in her arms. She was 62 years old, a career forensic pathologist who had worked in eastern Kentucky for 35 years, serving the mountain communities with quiet dedication and professional competence. She approached the body with the same careful, methodical process she brought to every case, setting aside whatever emotional reaction she might have felt at the sight of the young woman in the wedding dress. The initial examination at the scene revealed several critical details. The victim had been dead for approximately 12 to 18 hours, placing the time of death sometime between late afternoon and midnight on October 14th. The ligature marks on her neck were consistent with hanging, but Dr. Holland noted several anomalies that immediately raised questions. There were no defensive wounds on the victim's hands or arms, no signs of a struggle. Her makeup was perfectly intact, not smudged or streaked as might be expected if she had been crying or fighting. Most significantly, there were faint bruise marks on her upper arms, barely visible but unmistakable to someone with Dr. Holland's experience, suggesting she had been restrained or forcibly held at some point prior to death. The process of carefully lowering the body and transporting it to the state medical examiner's facility in Frankfort would take several more hours. Meanwhile, Brennan and his deputies began the painstaking work of canvassing the area for any additional evidence. They searched the abandoned Garrett house, finding nothing but years of accumulated debris, animal droppings, and the detritus of occasional squatters who had used the building for shelter. The house itself yielded no clues, no signs that anyone had been inside recently. The tire tracks near the road were photographed and cast in plaster, revealing the tread pattern of a common light truck or SUV, nothing distinctive enough to immediately narrow the search. There were no footprints clear enough to be useful, the ground too disturbed and the morning dew having obscured much of the detail. The only other significant piece of evidence was a small fragment of red fabric caught on a thorn bush about 20 yards from the tree, possibly torn from someone's clothing as they moved through the underbrush. As the day progressed and news of the discovery spread through the small communities of Harlan County, Brennan's phone began ringing with calls from concerned citizens, reporters, and officials from other agencies offering assistance. The image of the hanged bride, as the case was already being called by the local media, had a powerful emotional impact that transcended the usual numbness that characterized public response to violence in a region plagued by high crime rates and substance abuse. There was something about the symbolism, the perversion of wedding imagery combined with violent death, that struck a deep chord of horror and fascination. By late afternoon, the state police had established that the victim was not a local resident. No missing persons reports matching her description had been filed in Harlan County or any of the surrounding counties. Her fingerprints were not in any criminal database. The wedding dress bore no tags or labels that might indicate where it had been purchased, suggesting it had been custom-made or the identifying information had been deliberately removed. Even the bouquet of white roses provided no immediate leads, as white roses were common enough that tracking their purchase would be nearly impossible without additional information. The investigation faced its first major challenge. They had a victim but no identity, a carefully staged crime scene but no obvious motive, and no witnesses in an area so remote that the nearest occupied house was more than 3 miles away. Brennan stood in his office that evening, looking at the photographs pinned to the case board, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with every major investigation. Somewhere, someone was missing this young woman. Somewhere, there were family members or friends who would soon learn that she had died violently, her life cut short in circumstances that defied easy explanation. The medical examiner's preliminary report arrived via email at 7:15 that evening, and its contents only deepened the mystery. Dr. Holland had conducted a thorough examination and found no evidence of sexual assault, no signs of recent drug use beyond a small amount of alcohol consistent with moderate social drinking. The cause of death was asphyxiation by hanging, but the circumstances surrounding the hanging remained unclear. The bruising on the victim's upper arms suggested she had been restrained within 24 hours of death, but the lack of defensive wounds indicated either she had been unconscious or incapacitated when placed in the noose, or possibly that she had been coerced or manipulated into position without physical struggle. Most puzzling was a small tattoo discovered on the victim's left shoulder blade during the autopsy, a delicate design of intertwined birds that appeared to be relatively recent, perhaps 6 months to a year old. The tattoo was distinctive enough that it might help with identification if they could find anyone who recognized it. Brennan immediately sent the photograph of the tattoo to law enforcement agencies across Kentucky and neighboring states, hoping for a match in missing persons databases or through tips from the public. As night fell over Harlan County, bringing with it a cold rain that drummed against the windows of the sheriff's office, Brennan sat alone reviewing every detail of the case, searching for the thread that would unravel the mystery. The young woman in the wedding dress deserved justice, deserved to have her name spoken, her story told, her killer brought to account. But the path to that justice seemed shrouded in darkness as impenetrable as the fog that had greeted the morning's terrible discovery. The breakthrough came on the third day of the investigation, not through sophisticated forensic analysis or database searches, but through the old-fashioned police work of following leads and trusting human connections. A woman named Rebecca Thornton, a social worker from Pikeville, Kentucky, saw the photograph of the tattoo that had been released to the media and immediately recognized it. She called the sheriff's department at 9:30 in the morning on October 18th, her voice urgent and distressed, saying she knew who the victim might be. Rebecca explained that she had been working with a young woman named Emily Rose Harrison for the past 8 months, helping her navigate the complex process of leaving an abusive relationship. Emily had gotten that specific tattoo, the intertwined birds, as a symbol of freedom and new beginnings after finally escaping from her boyfriend of 4 years, a man named Daniel Wayne Cooper. The tattoo represented Emily's determination to fly free from the cage of violence and control that had defined her relationship with Cooper. Sheriff Brennan immediately dispatched deputies to Rebecca's office in Pikeville, a 40-minute drive from Lynch. Rebecca provided them with a file containing photographs of Emily, her personal information, and detailed notes about her case. The moment Brennan saw Emily's photograph, he knew they had found their victim. Emily Rose Harrison, 26 years old, originally from Prestonsburg, Kentucky, had been living in Pikeville for the past 9 months after fleeing the home she had shared with Daniel Cooper in Breathitt County. The photograph showed a beautiful young woman with long dark hair and warm brown eyes, her smile tentative but genuine, as if she was just learning how to be happy again after years of suffering. According to Rebecca's notes, Emily had endured 4 years of escalating abuse from Cooper, including physical violence, emotional manipulation, and complete financial control. She had finally found the courage to leave in February of 2023, obtaining a protective order and moving into a transitional housing facility in Pikeville where she could begin rebuilding her life. Rebecca's account painted a picture of a resilient woman struggling to overcome tremendous obstacles. Emily had been working 2 jobs, one as a waitress at a local diner and another cleaning houses, saving money with the hope of eventually going back to school to become a nurse. She had been attending counseling sessions, participating in a support group for domestic violence survivors, and slowly reconnecting with family members she had been isolated from during her relationship with Cooper. By all accounts, Emily had been making remarkable progress, finding her voice and her strength after years of being beaten down. But Rebecca also revealed a disturbing development that had occurred in the weeks leading up to Emily's death. Despite the protective order that legally prohibited Cooper from contacting Emily or coming within 500 feet of her, he had been violating that order repeatedly. Emily had reported multiple incidents to local police, Cooper showing up at her workplace, following her car, sending threatening text messages from burner phones, and even breaking into the transitional housing facility one night in early September. Each violation had been documented, but Cooper had managed to evade arrest, always disappearing before police arrived, always careful to avoid leaving evidence that would guarantee prosecution. The most chilling detail Rebecca shared was a conversation she had with Emily just 5 days before her death. Emily had seemed unusually anxious during their scheduled meeting, repeatedly checking her phone and glancing nervously at the windows of Rebecca's office. She confided that Cooper had been escalating his harassment, that he had somehow discovered she was planning to move to another state, possibly Tennessee or North Carolina, where she could truly start fresh beyond his reach. Cooper had sent her a series of messages, increasingly unhinged and threatening, insisting that if he could not have her, no one would, that she belonged to him and would never escape. Most significantly, Emily had told Rebecca that Cooper had been fixating on the idea of marriage during the final months of their relationship before she left. He had become obsessed with the notion that if they got married, Emily would somehow be permanently bound to him, unable to leave. He had proposed to her multiple times, each proposal more aggressive and demanding than the last. Emily's refusal to marry him had been one of the triggers for the worst episodes of violence she endured. The wedding dress, the staging of Emily's body as a bride, suddenly took on a horrifying new significance in light of this information. Armed with this critical information, Brennan immediately issued an arrest warrant for Daniel Wayne Cooper on suspicion of murder and began coordinating with law enforcement agencies across eastern Kentucky to locate him. Cooper's last known address was a rental house in Jackson, Breathitt County, where he had been living alone since Emily's departure. Deputies from the Breathitt County Sheriff's Department were dispatched to the address but found the house abandoned, with signs that Cooper had left in a hurry several days earlier. Neighbors reported seeing him loading belongings into his truck late on the night of October 13th, the day before Emily's body was discovered. The investigation into Cooper's background revealed a troubling pattern of violence and control that extended beyond his relationship with Emily. He was 32 years old, had grown up in Perry County in a household marked by severe domestic violence, and had dropped out of high school in his junior year. He had worked sporadically in various manual labor jobs, primarily in construction and coal mining, but had a history of being fired for aggressive behavior toward coworkers and supervisors. He had 2 prior arrests for assault, one involving a bar fight and another stemming from a road rage incident, though neither had resulted in significant jail time. Multiple ex-girlfriends came forward once news of the investigation became public, each sharing stories that echoed Emily's experience. Cooper had a consistent pattern of behavior. He would be charming and attentive in the early stages of a relationship, then gradually become possessive and controlling, isolating his partners from friends and family, monitoring their activities, and eventually escalating to physical violence. Several women described him as having an explosive temper that could be triggered by perceived slights or any attempt to assert independence. They also confirmed his obsession with marriage and commitment, viewing relationships as ownership rather than partnership. The forensic evidence collected from the crime scene began to paint a clearer picture of what had happened to Emily. Analysis of the tire tracks found near the Garrett property matched the tread pattern of Cooper's truck, a 2014 Ford F-150 that had been registered in his name. The fragment of red fabric caught on the thornbush was consistent with fibers found in Cooper's abandoned house, potentially torn from a shirt or jacket he had been wearing. Most damning was the rope used in the hanging, which was traced to a hardware store in Hazard, Kentucky, where security footage showed Cooper purchasing that exact type and length of rope on the morning of October 14th, just hours before Emily's estimated time of death. Cell phone records provided additional crucial evidence. Emily's phone had stopped transmitting at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon on October 14th, last pinging from a tower near Prestonsburg. Cooper's phone, which he had apparently discarded or destroyed after Emily's death, showed a pattern of movement that placed him in Prestonsburg around the same time, then traveling toward Harlan County later that evening. The timeline suggested he had intercepted Emily, possibly forced her into his vehicle, and transported her to the remote Garrett property where he carried out his brutal plan. As investigators dug deeper into Emily's final day, they discovered she had been on her way to visit her mother in Prestonsburg when she disappeared. Her mother, Linda Harrison, was devastated when sheriff's deputies arrived at her small frame house to inform her of Emily's death and request information about her daughter's last known movements. Linda was 63 years old, a retired school cafeteria worker living on a modest fixed income, and Emily had been her only child. Through her tears, Linda explained that Emily had called her around 3 in the afternoon on October 14th, excited and happy, saying she was on her way for a visit and had some important news to share. Emily never arrived. Linda had tried calling her repeatedly throughout the evening, growing increasingly worried as hours passed with no response. She had filed a missing persons report with the Prestonsburg Police Department late that night, but the report had been logged as a low-priority case, just one more person who had failed to show up as expected in a region where people disappeared with disturbing regularity, usually due to the opioid crisis or domestic situations. No one had connected Emily's disappearance with the body found the next morning in Harlan County, over 60 miles away, until Rebecca Thornton made the identification through the tattoo. Linda shared more about Emily's life and her relationship with Cooper, filling in details that helped investigators understand the dynamics that had led to tragedy. Emily and Cooper had met when she was 21, working as a cashier at a grocery store in Jackson where Cooper would come in regularly. He had pursued her persistently, showering her with attention and gifts, presenting himself as someone who would take care of her and protect her. Emily, who had grown up in poverty and had struggled with self-esteem issues throughout her childhood, had been flattered by Cooper's intense focus on her. The relationship deteriorated rapidly after Emily moved in with Cooper 6 months into their dating. He became increasingly controlling, demanding to know where she was at all times, who she talked to, what she wore. He isolated her from her mother and the few friends she had, claiming they were bad influences who did not understand their relationship. The physical abuse started about a year in, beginning with pushing and grabbing during arguments, then escalating to punches and choking. Emily had tried to leave multiple times, but Cooper would always find her, apologize profusely, promise to change, and convince her to return. What finally gave Emily the strength to leave for good was a particularly brutal assault in January of 2023, when Cooper beat her so severely that she suffered a concussion and 3 broken ribs. A neighbor heard Emily's screams and called the police, and Emily was transported to the hospital where medical staff documented her injuries and connected her with Rebecca Thornton and the domestic violence services in Pikeville. For the first time, Emily accepted help, obtained a protective order, and committed to staying away from Cooper despite his relentless attempts to draw her back. Linda told investigators about the important news Emily had mentioned during their last phone call, the news she never got to share in person. Emily had been accepted into a nursing program at a community college in Tennessee, set to begin in January. She had also been offered a job at a medical clinic in Knoxville that would provide her with steady income and benefits while she attended school. Emily had been preparing to move in early November, just 2 weeks away from leaving Kentucky and starting her new life far from Cooper's reach. She had been so close to freedom, so close to the future she had dreamed of during the darkest days of her captivity. The investigation intensified as law enforcement agencies across multiple states joined the manhunt for Daniel Cooper. His truck was found abandoned in a Walmart parking lot in Corbin, Kentucky, on October 19, 4 days after the discovery of Emily's body. The vehicle had been wiped clean of fingerprints, and any personal belongings had been removed, but forensic technicians found trace evidence that would prove crucial. Fibers matching Emily's clothing were found in the truck bed, along with soil samples that matched the composition of earth from the Garrett property. Most significantly, a single dark hair was recovered from the passenger seat that DNA testing confirmed belonged to Emily Harrison. The wedding dress itself provided additional investigative leads. Fashion experts and bridal shop owners across Kentucky were contacted with photographs of the dress, and eventually a seamstress in Whitesburg came forward with information. She recognized the dress as one she had been commissioned to create 6 months earlier by a man matching Cooper's description. He had provided measurements and specifications, paying in cash, and had picked up the completed dress in late September. The seamstress had thought it unusual that a man would be ordering a wedding dress alone, without the bride present for fittings, but Cooper had explained it was meant to be a surprise proposal. The level of premeditation this revealed was chilling, suggesting Cooper had been planning Emily's murder for months, carefully crafting the imagery of the hanged bride as his final act of control over the woman who had dared to escape him. As October gave way to November, the investigation had built a comprehensive case against Daniel Cooper, but the man himself remained at large. Law enforcement believed he had likely fled to a remote area, possibly camping in the vast Appalachian wilderness that stretched across multiple states, where a man with outdoor skills could potentially evade detection for extended periods. His face was distributed to media outlets across the region, and tips flooded in from various locations, though none led to his capture. Cooper had gone to ground, vanishing into the mountains that had shaped his identity and provided the backdrop for his crimes. The search for Daniel Wayne Cooper consumed the resources of multiple law enforcement agencies throughout November of 2023, as temperatures in the Appalachian Mountains dropped toward freezing and the first snows began to fall on the highest peaks. Sheriff Brennan coordinated with the Kentucky State Police, the FBI's Louisville field office, and law enforcement agencies in Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia, creating a regional task force dedicated to locating Cooper before he could harm anyone else or disappear permanently into the vast wilderness. The investigation revealed that Cooper had been far more calculating and methodical than initially apparent. Analysis of his computer, recovered from his abandoned house in Jackson, showed an extensive search history dating back 6 months that painted a disturbing picture of premeditation. Cooper had researched methods of killing that would appear to be suicide, studied anatomy and strangulation, looked up remote locations across eastern Kentucky where a body might not be discovered for days or weeks, and even searched for information about how long it took for bodies to decompose in different environmental conditions. More chilling were his searches related to wedding traditions, bridal photography, and the symbolism of white dresses in Western culture. He had visited forums and websites dedicated to wedding planning, seeming to obsess over every detail of how Emily would be presented in death. The computer also contained hundreds of photographs of Emily, most taken without her knowledge during the months after she left him, stalking photographs that showed her at work, walking to her car, entering and leaving the transitional housing facility. Cooper had been systematically tracking Emily's movements, learning her patterns, planning the perfect moment to strike. Financial records revealed Cooper had been preparing for his crime and subsequent flight for months. He had withdrawn his entire savings, approximately $3,200, in cash over a series of transactions designed not to trigger bank reporting requirements. He had purchased camping equipment, non-perishable food supplies, and several burner phones that he used to send threatening messages to Emily while avoiding detection. Credit card receipts showed he had made purchases at stores across a wide geographic area, suggesting he had been scouting potential escape routes and establishing supply caches in remote locations where he could hide. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit provided a psychological profile of Cooper that helped investigators understand his motivations and predict his behavior. The profile described Cooper as a possessive, narcissistic individual with deep-seated abandonment issues stemming from childhood trauma. His violence toward Emily was rooted in a pathological need for control and an inability to accept rejection. The wedding dress and the staging of Emily's body represented Cooper's attempt to reclaim ownership over Emily even in death, to transform her permanent escape into his permanent possession. The act of hanging her in a wedding dress was both punishment for leaving him and a perverse fulfillment of his obsession with binding her to him through marriage. The profile also suggested Cooper would experience no genuine remorse for his actions, viewing himself as the victim of Emily's betrayal. He would likely rationalize the murder as something she forced him to do by refusing to stay with him. The profilers predicted Cooper would remain in the region rather than fleeing to unfamiliar territory, as his identity was deeply connected to the mountains and he would feel vulnerable and exposed anywhere else. They also warned that Cooper remained dangerous, particularly if he felt cornered or encountered another woman who reminded him of Emily. Breakthrough information came from an unexpected source on November 28, when a retired coal miner named Robert McIntyre contacted the tip line with information about an old mining camp high in the mountains of Letcher County. McIntyre, 74 years old and suffering from black lung disease after 40 years working underground, explained that there was a network of abandoned mining structures scattered through the most remote sections of the county, left over from the days when small independent operations worked coal seams that were not economically viable for larger companies. Point One Camp in particular, McIntyre said, would be an ideal hiding place. It was located deep in the mountains, accessible only by a treacherous four-wheel drive trail that was not marked on any maps and was known only to locals who had worked the mines decades earlier. The camp consisted of 3 structures: a main bunkhouse where miners had slept, a smaller building that had served as an office and supply storage, and a collapsed equipment shed. The bunkhouse was still reasonably sound, protected from the elements, with a working fireplace that could provide heat during the cold months. McIntyre mentioned it because he had seen a man matching Cooper's description purchasing supplies at a rural store near Isom, Kentucky, several days earlier, and the specific combination of items purchased, including firewood, canned goods, and kerosene, suggested someone planning to stay in an isolated location without electricity or running water. Acting on this information, a tactical team consisting of state police officers, FBI agents, and experienced local deputies who knew the terrain assembled on the morning of November 30th. The plan was to approach the mining camp before dawn, using the darkness and element of surprise to maximize safety and minimize the chance of Cooper escaping or harming himself or others. The team, led by Kentucky State Police Lieutenant James Crawford, included 12 officers equipped for a mountain operation in winter conditions, with cold weather gear, night vision equipment, and weapons appropriate for a potentially violent confrontation. The approach to the mining camp required a 4-mile hike up a steep mountain trail through terrain that was treacherous even in daylight. The officers moved slowly and carefully, their boots crunching on frozen leaves, their breath visible in the cold air that hovered just above 20 degrees. Snow had fallen 2 days earlier, leaving a light dusting on the ground that made tracking easier but also made approach more difficult. The forest was silent except for the occasional call of an owl or the rustle of wind through bare branches, the kind of profound quiet that only exists in truly remote wilderness. They reached a position overlooking the mining camp at 5:15 in the morning, more than an hour before sunrise. Through night vision binoculars, they could see smoke rising from the chimney of the bunkhouse, confirming someone was inside. A vehicle matching the description of a truck Cooper had been suspected of stealing 3 weeks earlier was partially hidden behind the collapsed equipment shed, covered with branches and camouflage netting in an attempt at concealment. The team established a perimeter around the camp, positioning officers at strategic points to prevent escape, then waited for enough light to safely execute the arrest. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky with bands of orange and pink, Lieutenant Crawford made the decision to move in. 4 officers approached the bunkhouse from different angles while others maintained overwatch positions. Crawford announced their presence through a megaphone, identifying himself and demanding Cooper come out with his hands visible. For a long moment, there was no response, just the continued thin stream of smoke from the chimney and the sound of wind whistling through the camp's broken windows. Then the door of the bunkhouse opened slowly, and Daniel Wayne Cooper emerged into the cold morning. He was gaunt and haggard, having lost significant weight during his month in hiding, his face covered with an unkempt beard and his eyes bloodshot and hollow. He wore multiple layers of clothing against the cold and held his hands up, showing he was unarmed. The officers moved in quickly, securing him in handcuffs and conducting an immediate safety check before transporting him back down the mountain to a waiting vehicle. Cooper said nothing during his arrest, maintaining complete silence as he was read his rights and escorted to the state police barracks in Pikeville for processing and interrogation. The bunkhouse where he had been hiding was secured as a crime scene and thoroughly searched for evidence. Investigators found a small arsenal of supplies that indicated Cooper had been planning to remain in hiding for months if necessary. He had stockpiled enough food for possibly half a year, had multiple changes of clothes, significant quantities of kerosene for light and heat, and hunting equipment that would allow him to supplement his supplies with wild game. Most significantly, they found a notebook that Cooper had been writing in during his weeks in isolation. The notebook contained rambling entries that provided insight into his mindset both before and after Emily's murder. The entries from before October 14th described his surveillance of Emily, his rage at her plans to move away, and his conviction that she belonged to him and had no right to build a life without him. He wrote about purchasing the wedding dress, explaining in disturbing detail how he intended to stage her death as the bride she should have been, how he would make her beautiful and perfect and his forever. The entries after Emily's murder were even more chilling, showing no remorse or recognition of wrongdoing. Cooper wrote about the murder itself in clinical, detached terms, describing how he had waited for Emily on the road between Pikeville and Prestonsburg, how he had forced her into his truck at gunpoint, and how he had driven her to the Garrett property. He described making her put on the wedding dress while threatening her with violence if she resisted, how she had begged and pleaded for her life, promising anything if he would let her go. But he had been unmoved by her tears, viewing her terror as confirmation that she had always known she belonged to him. Cooper wrote about placing the rope around Emily's neck, about hoisting her up into the tree while she was still conscious, about watching as she struggled and died. He described it not as murder but as a marriage ceremony, a binding of their souls that could never be undone. He expressed satisfaction that no one would ever touch her or love her now, that she was his and his alone for eternity. The level of delusion and narcissism revealed in these entries was profound, showing a complete inability to recognize Emily's humanity or autonomy, seeing her only as an object that existed for his possession and control. The interrogation of Cooper, conducted by experienced detectives with FBI oversight, lasted over 12 hours across multiple sessions. Cooper initially maintained his silence, refusing to speak with or acknowledge his interrogators. But as the evidence against him was methodically presented, including the forensic findings, the witness statements, the computer search history, and most damningly his own notebook, he began to respond. However, he never expressed remorse or admitted guilt in the way prosecutors hoped. Instead, he rationalized and justified his actions, repeatedly insisting that Emily had forced his hand by refusing to be with him, that she had promised to love him forever and then betrayed that promise. Cooper's version of events, filtered through his distorted perspective, revealed the depths of his delusion. He genuinely believed that Emily had been happy with him, that their relationship had been perfect until outside influences, particularly Rebecca Thornton and the domestic violence advocates, had poisoned Emily's mind against him. He claimed he had never truly hurt Emily, that any physical altercations had been her fault for provoking him, for not understanding how much he loved her and how much he needed her. He described the murder not as violence but as inevitability, as the only possible outcome when someone breaks a sacred bond. The most disturbing moment of the interrogation came when Cooper was shown photographs of Emily's body as it had been found hanging from the tree in her wedding dress. For the first time, he showed genuine emotion, but not remorse or horror. Instead, he smiled slightly and said she looked beautiful, that she was finally what she should have been all along, his bride, bound to him in a way that could never be broken. The detectives were so unsettled by this response that they had to take a break to compose themselves before continuing. The legal process moved forward with efficiency. Cooper was formally charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, stalking, and multiple violations of the protective order Emily had obtained. The case was assigned to Commonwealth's attorney Margaret Chen, an experienced prosecutor known for her advocacy for victims of domestic violence. Chen was 56 years old, had grown up in a coal mining family in Bell County, and had spent her entire career fighting for justice in cases that often received insufficient attention from a legal system overwhelmed by the volume of crime in the region. Chen understood that Cooper's case was about more than just one murder, no matter how brutal. It represented the endemic problem of domestic violence in Appalachian communities, where economic stress, social isolation, and cultural attitudes about relationships created conditions where abuse could flourish unchecked. Emily Harrison's death had captured public attention in a way that highlighted the failures of systems designed to protect vulnerable women from dangerous men. Despite the protective order, despite Emily's reports of violations, despite multiple opportunities to intervene, the system had failed to stop Cooper before he murdered the woman he claimed to love. The preliminary hearing took place in mid-December, a formality that allowed Cooper's public defender to review the evidence and assess the strength of the prosecution's case. The evidence was overwhelming, and there was no realistic possibility of acquittal if the case went to trial. The defense attorney, a dedicated professional named Thomas Whitaker who took his responsibility to provide competent representation seriously despite his personal revulsion at Cooper's crimes, advised his client that the only rational course was to negotiate a plea agreement that would at least avoid the death penalty. Kentucky was a death penalty state, and the circumstances of Emily's murder, the premeditation, the stalking, the violation of protective orders, all qualified the case for capital prosecution. Commonwealth's Attorney Chen had to decide whether to seek death or accept a plea to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She consulted with Emily's mother Linda, who despite her grief and rage had no desire to spend years going through the trauma of a capital trial and appeals. Linda wanted Cooper locked away forever, unable to hurt anyone else, but she did not want her daughter's memory forever tied to legal proceedings that would drag on for decades. On December 20, 2023, exactly 9 weeks after Emily's body was discovered, Daniel Wayne Cooper stood before Judge Robert Haynes in the Harlan County Circuit Court and pleaded guilty to all charges. In exchange for his plea, the death penalty was taken off the table, and Cooper was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive sentences for kidnapping and stalking totaling 75 years. Judge Haynes, a 68-year-old veteran of the bench who had presided over countless cases involving violence and tragedy, took the unusual step of making a statement before pronouncing sentence. Judge Haynes spoke directly to Cooper, noting that in his 40 years on the bench he had never encountered a case that so clearly illustrated the twisted logic of possessive violence. He said that Cooper's claims of love for Emily were the most profound mockery of that word, that love does not control or threaten or kill, that Cooper had demonstrated nothing but selfish narcissism and brutal disregard for the humanity of the woman he claimed to care about. He noted that Cooper would spend the rest of his natural life in prison, that he would never again have the opportunity to exercise power over another human being, and that perhaps in the decades of confinement ahead he might finally develop the capacity for genuine remorse that he had shown no evidence of thus far. Cooper showed no emotion as he was led from the courtroom in shackles, beginning his journey to the Kentucky State Penitentiary in Eddyville where he would spend the remainder of his life. For Emily's family and friends, for Rebecca Thornton and the domestic violence advocates who had tried so hard to save her, for Sheriff Brennan and the investigators who had worked tirelessly to bring Cooper to justice, the conclusion of the legal case brought a measure of closure but no real peace. Emily was gone, her potential unfulfilled, her dreams of freedom and education and a life beyond violence cut short by a man who believed he owned her. The months following Daniel Cooper's conviction and imprisonment brought a period of grief and reflection for the communities of eastern Kentucky that had been touched by Emily Harrison's murder. Her death became a catalyst for conversations about domestic violence that had been long overdue in a region where such violence often remained hidden behind closed doors, where cultural attitudes about privacy and family loyalty sometimes prevented intervention even when abuse was known to be occurring. Linda Harrison, Emily's mother, channeled her grief into action, becoming an advocate for other women trapped in abusive relationships. She began working with Rebecca Thornton and the domestic violence services in Pikeville, sharing Emily's story with groups of women who were struggling to find the courage to leave dangerous partners. Linda's presence and testimony were powerful, the living embodiment of the consequences when violence is not stopped. She spoke plainly about her regrets, about times she had suspected Emily was being hurt but had not pushed harder to intervene, about the ways she had failed her daughter by not fully understanding the danger Cooper represented. Through Linda's advocacy, Emily's story reached women who were living parallel lives, trapped in relationships marked by control and violence, afraid to leave because of threats and manipulation. Linda told them that leaving was possible, that resources existed to help them, that they deserved lives free from fear and pain. She also spoke to law enforcement groups and court officials, challenging them to take protective orders more seriously, to devote more resources to pursuing violators, to understand that a piece of paper alone could not keep a determined abuser away from his victim. Emily had done everything right, had obtained the order, had reported violations, had sought help, and still she had died. The system needed to do better. Rebecca Thornton, the social worker who had worked with Emily and made the identification that broke the case open, struggled with her own guilt and trauma in the aftermath. She second-guessed every decision she had made in Emily's case, wondering if there was something more she could have done, some way she could have prevented the tragedy. She entered therapy herself to process the impact of losing a client in such a horrific manner, working through the reality that even the most dedicated professionals cannot save everyone, that some abusers are so dangerous and determined that they will find a way to harm their victims no matter what safeguards are in place. Through her healing process, Rebecca became more vocal about the need for systemic changes in how domestic violence is addressed. She advocated for increased funding for transitional housing, for expanded legal services to help victims navigate the complex process of obtaining and enforcing protective orders, and for better training for law enforcement on the lethality factors that indicate when an abuser is likely to escalate to murder. She shared data showing that the period when a victim leaves an abusive relationship is the most dangerous time, when the abuser's sense of lost control can trigger lethal violence. Emily had been in this danger zone, and the systems designed to protect her had not been adequate to the threat Cooper posed. Sheriff Michael Brennan, who had led the investigation from the moment Emily's body was discovered, found himself changed by the case in ways both subtle and profound. He had investigated murders before, had seen violence in many forms, but Emily's case haunted him in a way others had not. Perhaps it was the symbolism of the wedding dress, the perversion of imagery associated with love and commitment into a tableau of death. Perhaps it was the methodical nature of Cooper's planning, the months of calculated stalking and preparation. Or perhaps it was simply the accumulation of too many years seeing too much suffering in communities that seemed to be slowly dying from economic collapse and social decay. Brennan began questioning whether his work made any real difference, whether arresting one killer simply made room for the next tragedy in a region plagued by violence rooted in poverty, lack of opportunity, and generational trauma. But he also recognized that Emily's case, as horrific as it was, had created momentum for change. The publicity surrounding her death had brought attention to domestic violence in Appalachian communities in a way that years of statistics and advocacy had not achieved. If Emily's tragedy could prevent even one other woman from suffering a similar fate, if it could inspire changes that made victims safer and abusers more accountable, then perhaps some meaning could be found in the senselessness. The community of Pikeville, where Emily had been working to rebuild her life in her final months, came together to honor her memory. A memorial service was held at the community center in January of 2024, attended by over 300 people, many of whom had never met Emily but felt connected to her story. Rebecca Thornton spoke about Emily's courage, about the strength it took to leave an abusive relationship and try to start over. She described Emily's dreams of becoming a nurse, her desire to help others who were suffering, her belief that she could transform her experiences of trauma into wisdom that would allow her to comfort others. Linda Harrison spoke through her tears, telling the gathered mourners about the daughter she had loved and lost, about Emily's kindness and gentle spirit, about the little girl who had loved to sing and dance and dreamed of making the world better. She shared memories of Emily's childhood, of summer days playing in the creek near their home, of Emily's determination to succeed in school despite their poverty, of her compassion for anyone who was hurting or in need. She also spoke honestly about the darkness that Cooper had brought into Emily's life, about the years of abuse that had dimmed her daughter's light but never extinguished it completely. The memorial service concluded with the announcement of the Emily Rose Harrison Scholarship Fund, established to provide financial assistance to women who were leaving abusive relationships and pursuing education or job training. The fund was seeded with donations that poured in from across Kentucky and beyond, people moved by Emily's story and wanting to ensure that her death contributed to positive change. The scholarships would help women like Emily achieve the dreams that had been taken from her, would give them the tools to build independent lives free from the men who had sought to control and diminish them. In the months that followed, changes began to take shape in how domestic violence cases were handled in eastern Kentucky. The state legislature, responding to public pressure generated by Emily's case and the advocacy of people like Linda Harrison and Rebecca Thornton, passed new legislation strengthening protective orders and enhancing penalties for violations. Police departments received additional training on risk assessment, learning to identify the warning signs that an abuser might escalate to lethal violence. Courts implemented new protocols for monitoring protective order compliance, with more aggressive pursuit of violations. The abandoned Garrett property where Emily had been murdered became an unexpected memorial site, with people leaving flowers, candles, and small tokens at the base of the tree where her body had been found. The current property owner, a distant cousin of the original Garretts who lived out of state, initially wanted to cut down the tree and demolish the house to erase the association with tragedy. But after speaking with Linda Harrison, he had a change of heart and instead donated the property to a non-profit organization that would establish it as a memorial garden dedicated to victims of domestic violence. The transformation of the property took place over the summer of 2024, with volunteers clearing decades of overgrowth, stabilizing the old house, and creating walking paths through the surrounding woods. The tree where Emily died was left standing, but a brass plaque was mounted nearby, bearing her name and dates and a simple inscription that read, "Emily Rose Harrison, 26 years old, dreamed of freedom and a future of service to others, murdered by the man who claimed to love her. May her memory inspire us to protect those still suffering in silence." The memorial garden became a place of pilgrimage for domestic violence survivors, a quiet space in the mountains where they could reflect on their own struggles and draw strength from Emily's story. Support groups began holding meetings there during warm weather months, sitting in circles on benches that had been installed throughout the property, sharing their experiences and finding solidarity in their common fight for freedom and healing. The location, once a scene of horror, slowly transformed into a place of remembrance and hope, a symbol that even the darkest tragedies could give rise to light. For Sheriff Brennan, the case of the hanged bride remained the defining investigation of his career, the case against which all others would be measured. He kept a photograph of Emily on his office wall, not the crime scene photos or evidence images, but a picture Linda had given him showing Emily laughing at some forgotten moment of happiness, her face open and joyful, the woman she should have been allowed to remain. The photograph served as a daily reminder of why his work mattered, of the human cost when systems failed, of the responsibility he bore to protect the vulnerable even when that protection seemed impossibly difficult. The legal proceedings continued even after Cooper's imprisonment, as Emily's family filed a civil lawsuit against various entities they believed had failed to protect her. They sued the Breathitt County Sheriff's Department for inadequate response to Emily's reports of protective order violations, the property management company that ran the transitional housing facility for failing to provide adequate security, and even the hardware store where Cooper purchased the rope, though that claim was eventually dismissed as having no legal merit. The civil cases would drag on for years, some settling out of court, others dismissed, but all serving to keep Emily's story in the public consciousness and maintain pressure for systemic reforms. Daniel Wayne Cooper himself faded into the obscurity of the prison system, just one more inmate among thousands serving life sentences in Kentucky's correctional facilities. Prison records indicated he had been involved in several altercations during his first year of incarceration, his aggressive tendencies finding new targets in the confined world of the cell block. He showed no interest in rehabilitation programs or therapy, maintaining the same narcissistic worldview that had led to Emily's murder. He received no visitors, as even his own family had disowned him after learning the full extent of his crimes. He would spend decades in a 6 by 8 foot cell, his life reduced to the routines and restrictions of maximum security confinement, his name remembered only as the monster who killed Emily Harrison. The one-year anniversary of Emily's death, October 14, 2024, brought renewed media attention to the case and the issues it had highlighted. National news outlets ran retrospective pieces examining domestic violence in rural America, using Emily's story as a lens through which to explore broader patterns of abuse, poverty, and the challenges of providing services in remote areas. Documentaries were produced, podcasts dedicated episodes to analyzing the case, and Emily became an unwilling symbol of a problem that extended far beyond Appalachian Kentucky. Linda Harrison, though exhausted by the constant attention and the repeated reliving of her daughter's death, continued to speak publicly about Emily's case whenever asked. She understood that keeping Emily's story alive might save other lives, that visibility and awareness could drive change in ways that quiet grief could not. She attended conferences on domestic violence, served on advisory boards for victim services organizations, and became a voice for mothers who had lost daughters to intimate partner violence. Her advocacy was fueled by love for Emily and determination that her daughter's death would mean something beyond tragedy. As the second anniversary approached in October 2025, the immediate intensity of public attention had faded, replaced by the quieter ongoing work of implementing reforms and supporting survivors. The Emily Rose Harrison Scholarship Fund had helped 37 women pursue education and job training, giving them pathways out of poverty and dependence. The memorial garden at the Garrett property had welcomed thousands of visitors, becoming a recognized destination for those seeking to honor victims of domestic violence. Legislative changes had resulted in more aggressive enforcement of protective orders, though advocates argued much more needed to be done. For Rebecca Thornton, returning to work after her grief and trauma remained difficult, but she found purpose in continuing Emily's fight. Each new client who came to her for help escaping an abusive relationship represented both a responsibility and an opportunity. She worked with renewed intensity to ensure that every woman in her caseload had safety planning, resources, and support systems in place. She could not save Emily, but she could honor Emily's memory by saving others, by learning from the failures that had allowed Cooper to murder the woman he had tormented for years. Sheriff Brennan continued his work in Harlan County, investigating crimes and trying to maintain order in communities struggling with poverty and violence. But Emily's case had changed his perspective, made him more attuned to the dynamics of domestic violence, more aggressive about pursuing protective order violations, more willing to devote resources to cases that might once have been seen as low priority. He trained his deputies on risk assessment, ensured they understood that a protective order violation was not just a technical infraction but potentially a warning sign of imminent danger. Emily's death had taught him that sometimes the difference between life and death was a law enforcement officer taking a report seriously and following through. The broader legacy of Emily Rose Harrison's murder continued to unfold in ways both measurable and intangible. Measurable in the statistics showing increased arrests for protective order violations, in the number of women served by domestic violence programs that had received increased funding partly due to publicity around Emily's case, in the scholarships granted and lives redirected. Intangible in the conversations that took place in homes across Appalachia, women recognizing their own experiences in Emily's story and finding courage to seek help, family members understanding the warning signs they had been missing, communities beginning to shed the culture of silence that allowed abuse to flourish unchallenged. That Emily's story became part of the collective memory of Eastern Kentucky, referenced in discussions about violence against women, cited in arguments for better funding, and resources, invoked by advocates seeking to drive change. Her name appeared in training materials for law enforcement, in curriculum for social workers, in educational programs for young people about healthy relationships. The image of the hanged bride, once a symbol of horror, gradually transformed into a symbol of the work still needed to protect vulnerable women from dangerous men. The final chapter of Emily's story, if it could be said to have a final chapter, was written not in courtrooms or memorial gardens but in the individual decisions of women who recognized themselves in her struggle and chose to leave before it was too late. Statistics would never capture how many lives were saved by Emily's example, how many potential victims saw the trajectory of their own relationships and made the difficult choice to escape while escape was still possible. Each woman who left an abusive partner, Each family that intervened to protect a loved one, each law enforcement officer who treated a protective order violation as the serious crime it was, represented Emily's enduring impact on the world she had been forced to leave. Linda Harrison continued to live in Prestonsburg, in the same small house where she had raised Emily, where she had waited in vain for her daughter to arrive on that October afternoon 2 years earlier. The house was filled with photographs of Emily at every age, documenting a life that should have continued but had been brutally cut short. Linda found comfort in her advocacy work, in knowing that Emily's suffering had not been meaningless, that other women were safer because of the changes Emily's death had catalyzed. But the comfort was cold compared to the warmth of her daughter's embrace, and no amount of activism could fill the void Emily had left behind. That on quiet evenings, Linda would sit on her porch and look toward the mountains that had shaped this region and its people for generations, mountains that held both beauty and tragedy in their ancient folds. She thought about Emily as a little girl playing in these mountains, full of life and dreams and innocence. She thought about the woman Emily had become, struggling to escape the violence that had trapped her, fighting for the future she deserved. And she thought about the promise that had ended in tragedy, the promise of a new life that Daniel Cooper had stolen with his selfish, possessive rage. The case of the hanged bride, as it was still known in the media and in law enforcement circles, served as a stark reminder of the consequences when domestic violence is not taken seriously enough, when protective orders are treated as suggestions rather than legal mandates, when victims are blamed for remaining in or returning to abusive relationships rather than perpetrators being held accountable for their choice to commit violence. Emily Harrison had done everything right, had found the courage to leave, had sought help, had reported violations, had planned for her safety. And still she had died, because the man who claimed to love her believed he owned her and would rather see her dead than free. The mountains of Appalachia continued their ancient existence, indifferent to human suffering, bearing witness to generations of struggle and survival. The coal economy that had once sustained these communities continued its long decline, leaving behind contaminated water, scarred landscapes, and populations struggling with poverty and lack of opportunity. In this environment of economic stress and social breakdown, violence found fertile ground, and women bore disproportionate burdens of that violence. Emily's story was unique in its horrific details but tragically common in its fundamental pattern of abuse, control, and ultimately murder. As the sun set over Harlan County on another autumn evening 2 years after Emily's death, the memorial garden at the Garrett property stood quiet and peaceful, the old oak tree's branches swaying gently in the breeze. The flowers left by visitors dotted the ground, testament to lives touched by Emily's story. In the fading light, the brass plaque bearing Emily's name caught the last rays of sun, gleaming briefly before darkness fell. The memorial would stand as long as the tree stood, as long as people remembered that Emily Rose Harrison had lived and dreamed and fought for her freedom, and that she deserved to be remembered not for how she died but for how courageously she tried to live. Her legacy would be measured not in headlines or legal cases but in the women who survived because her story gave them strength, in the systems that improved because her death exposed their failures, in the continuing fight to ensure that no other young woman would have her dreams of freedom transformed into a wedding dress and a rope and a tree in the forgotten mountains of Appalachia. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.